Welcome back to the David Watson podcast. Today I spoke with Dr. Joe Joe McManus, and we had a brief conversation about his book, A Brother's Insight, a guidance on defeating racism and advancing freedom. I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, welcome to the David Watson podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Glad to be here.
Very nice of you to come on. And you're here to talk about, it's your book, isn't it? It's a book. Yeah, I can see it in the background, A Brother's Insight. And
right.
So let's just, what's it about? What happened?
Well, it's a book specifically about anti-racism and anti-oppression. But it uses my personal stories from growing up and as a professional for the last 25, 30 years, doing anti-racism work, doing the dreaded DEI work that everybody's talking about right now, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and mostly in higher education. And I taught and became staff and administration and an executive chief diversity officer. And now mostly I advise college and university presidents and chief diversity officers on the issues of the day around diversity, equity, and inclusion.
So, because DEI is kind of, it's a tricky one. And I'm not sure how we have, I don't know how it works in America versus the UK. And I don't know if we call it DEI in the UK. I know there's been a couple of instances which has obviously caused people to be upset, where I think it was the BBC. If I've got that wrong, I'll apologise up front. But they actually said no whites need apply.
I've never heard of anything like that, so I can't speak to the BBC.
No.
But
so we've kind of had it. We have it kind of a little bit the other way round. How exactly does it work in America? Well,
the idea is that we look at the realities in our country, in the United States, and the different types of oppression that exist, and we do our best to try to level the playing field. And so that comes out in a lot of different ways, depending on the sector that you're in. And in higher ed, we talk a lot about admissions and hiring and promotion, curriculum and pedagogy. But the idea is to try to counter white supremacy, counter sexism, counter heterosexism and homophobia, in order to develop a workplace that's an inclusive space for people, and that provides equitable opportunities for everybody.
So where in America then are people disadvantaged?
I don't mean to be flip, but everywhere.
Yeah, but
I don't know what.
I'm in England.
I need more.
No, well, because I'm in England, so I'm in the UK, and I don't have any advantage over anybody else. So.
Well, I'm not in England. I've been there.
Because I hear this a lot in America about people from America saying, and I hear different people. But if I don't live there, I don't know which person is listening to which echo chamber, and which person. Do you know what I mean? Because there's individual experiences versus people. Well, this is what I think happened. So. It's and look, I'll give you a good example of a stereotype because I can talk from personal experience. Everybody thinks people in Russia are bad because there's a thing going on with Ukraine, and everybody says Russia's bad. I've been to Moscow 5 times. The people in Moscow were lovely. Do you know what I mean? They're not responsible for their country's politics, and just like if you go to Ukraine, they're not responsible for Russia's politics. Do you know what I mean? It's so. In the UK, I've never come across discrimination because of someone's sexuality. I never personally come across people being discriminated against because of their colour, and I can only say that as somebody worked with lots of people from different backgrounds. Interestingly, because my mum is actually Irish, she remembers when she first come to the UK, it wouldn't be that uncommon on like buildings like that used to do like what we call bed and breakfast, which is like an overnight stay place, and it would say no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. Do you know what I mean? So there was lots of prejudice towards the Irish.
Sure.
And obviously I from what I know from American films, there was lots of prejudice towards everybody. If you're Irish, if you're Italian, if you were black, if you're Native American, it was just like a lot of prejudice. But I don't know how much of that exists today in in actual reality.
Yeah, well, I'll say this. I lived in Russia for a year, and I had a similar experience.
Yeah.
Lovely people, as you said. But I think we all are responsible for what our governments do to some degree, right? In my country, I didn't vote for him, but somehow we voted for Donald Trump, and now we're dealing with the consequences of that. We were well aware of his white supremacist leanings. We're well aware of the policies that he was promoting. And the majority of people who voted brought him, put him in there. But that doesn't mean that all of us aren't responsible for trying to hold him to account, hold the government to account. So that's why we protest. That's why we speak up.
What's he done then that's white supremacist?
How much time have we got?
I'm good for the next 50 minutes.
Okay. Well, I think there's a long list. It's very easy to find online. But what I will say is that his policies in education, for example, I primarily work in education, trying to get rid of African American studies, ending diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher ed and in P12. The list goes on. Ending grants to organizations that support diversity, and just attacking people in that organizations in that way. The same thing when we come to immigration. The work that's being done in immigration is really directed toward Black and brown folks and trying to deport Black and brown folks, while at the same time making special.
But these are people. Just to clarify, are these people that have entered the country illegally?
Yeah, in some cases, but there's no due process. That's the problem.
Yeah.
They're not doing the due process to ensure that these are people who are undocumented, number one, or that have committed some crime. But what's happening now is that people are being locked up and deported simply for, taking advantage of free speech, which is a right in this country. And we have every right to protest. We have every right to speak and say anything we want, pretty much except yelling fire in a movie theater.
But are they?
Right?
But he can't deport American citizens, can he?
But he has.
So I'm not aware. Do you know what I mean? Because obviously I'm not in America. So these are American citizens, American passport holders.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
How is he? I don't understand how you're able to deport somebody then.
Well, our courts don't either, and there's battles going on in our court system right now to say that's not okay. You can't do that. But these are things. These are a few examples of what's happening that are rooted in white supremacy, and a lot of the things that he puts online support white supremacy. There's tons of examples. It's not hidden, and a lot of these things are. He knows he's not ultimately going to succeed, but they're dog whistles to a white supremacist base.
I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm just saying you've just said again lots of examples. You haven't given me an example.
Mm-hmm. No.
Well, I'm not saying it doesn't.
Those are examples. They're the people that have been deported that are Black and brown without due process. But the banning of books about diversity, he's banned books. There's bans on books related to Rosa Parks, related to Martin Luther King, people that we see as heroes and as people that have helped make our country better. And talking about his Secretary of Education talking about teaching to be patriotic in school and not talking about anything negative from our history, which, as you can understand, is important that we learn from our history. But if we pretend we've never done anything that was not good, or there's never been anything bad happen in this country, we're not going to learn from it and do better. So, and of course, that stomps on academic freedom and freedom of speech as well, which are things that we hold very dear in this country. But teachers and professors have been let go. University presidents have been let go, specifically because they are standing up for academic freedom and free speech, right? And then, of course, there's been the crackdowns that I'm sure you've seen on protests against the Israeli occupation of Gaza and genocide. And again, these are people just exercising their right to free speech. And the universities are some of them are cracking down on their own, and then the federal government is getting involved and taking people who have their visas in order, and there's no reason to lock them up except that they think that they're saying things publicly that they don't like.
I think
that's not something that is in line with our freedom of speech.
Yeah, but as somebody that had to have a visa to come to America and had to jump through a lot of hoops to get one,
sure,
freedom of speech doesn't apply to non-US citizens in your country.
Of course it does. No, it applies to anybody. Yes, it does.
It's a federal law.
Allows it.
It's a federal law.
The Constitution allows free speech.
Yeah,
for any person in the United States, not citizen, any person.
Okay, I thought you. I would concede completely, but it's not how I understood it when I got detained on a visa when I tried to enter your country in 2019. I mean, I was allowed in because my paperwork is in order, but it was made very clear to me by the customs guy, who was very nice. But you're in America now, mate, and you're a guest, and as a personal opinion, I think if you are a guest in somebody's country, you shouldn't be protesting anything. You should just be remembering that you're a guest.
Well, the people that they've been cracking down are educators and students who are here on either a work visa as an educator. Or
it's just a personal opinion. I think if you're in a country,
I hear you. But for me, part of what it is to have an education at American university is to engage on social issues. That's part of what the experience is. Otherwise, you might as well just do everything online and not engage.
You can engage.
Engaging and saying, "Hey, I'm in favor of this," and you do it in a peaceful way. There's absolutely no reason.
I know what you're saying. I just, it's a personal opinion. It's not. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm not saying it's for everybody. I just, if you go to another country and you're on a visa, I don't think you should be involved in protesting. I think you should just be kind of discretion being the better part of valor, and just have a respectful.
Think about it this way. Let's say that you come to the United States as a faculty member at a university, and you've been living here for a number of years teaching your courses. And then the United States invades England.
Yep.
Unprovoked. Invades England, and there's protests saying, "Why are you invading our ally? That's ridiculous. Why would you do that?" Right? And then you get detained for speaking your mind. That's unacceptable in this country. We have freedom of speech for a reason. It's part of how we hold accountable those leaders that do things that we don't agree with. It's important in this country. It's very important.
Yeah, I mean, in those scenarios, I would expect to be detained immediately for being English. But I mean, we have a bigger problem in the UK where people are already in prison for just putting up Facebook posts and have actually been arrested and are in prison for just saying things the government doesn't like. So there was a statistic that came out recently. There's more people in prison for things they've said than there are in the UK than there is in Russia.
That's remarkable.
Yeah.
And here in this country, I can say that's against our Constitution. Like, it's specific that if you're in this country, you have the freedom to say whatever you want to say. Right? There's no freedom to violence. There's those kind of things. But we have freedom to say what we want to say with no restriction. And we've famously, I think, led the charge on that around the world. That we believe in free speech. We believe that if you have something to say about anybody or about anything, You have the right to say it. It
Mm.
doesn't mean there won't be consequences. Socially, there might be consequences in other ways, but legally, you're allowed to say whatever you want to say.
Yeah, we technically, legally, we do, but we don't in practice, because we have hate law speeches, and if somebody decides something comes under a hate law,
Yeah.
they're like, okay, well, you can go to prison for that now. But hate law could literally be, you could say just something about me that, and they say, well, that's quite hateful, so it's time for you to go to prison now. And it's like, oh, but it's true.
We have hate speech is a thing, but it is free speech.
Yeah.
And we've been told for decades in higher education that we have to allow white supremacists to say whatever they want to say, and we counter that with more free speech, right? But what's happened with Gaza in particular is that they've been saying that that's different somehow.
Yeah.
And so they're cracking down and saying that if you're speaking against genocide, somehow you're anti-Semitic. And as a Jew, I think that's ridiculous. Jewish people have been at the forefront of fighting against Zionism from day one. And most of the people that are leading the charge in this fight against genocide are Jewish people saying, not in my name, right? But there's been a crackdown saying, oh, sorry, you can't do this on a college campus, even though there's always been free speech on college campuses. And there's been crackdowns before. During the civil rights movement, there was crackdowns that I'm sure you've seen video of. But people keep fighting, and we believe deeply in our freedom to speak because of the fact that it's one of the most important ways that we can hold our elected officials to account. That and our vote.
Yeah. No, voting is the way. It's definitely the one. So the book you wrote, what's it? A Brother's Insight. So what's it about?
Well, the idea is that I'm trying to help people understand white supremacy and other forms of oppression through sharing stories about my experience, my brother's experience. My brother was adopted as African American, one of my brothers, and his experience growing up and my experience as his brother. And we lost my brother. He was a victim of suicide. When I was 18, he was 17. And I talk about the impact of that and why it happened, and at least to my understanding. And I go into what I've done as a professional and try to help people understand that their voice really matters with respect to addressing these issues, whether it be racism, sexism, heterosexism, whatever it might be, that our voices really do matter. And I try to help people understand what I mean by voice as well. We always hear you should speak up and raise your voice, but it doesn't always mean protest, for example. It means decision making more than anything else, right? And I talk about in the book how making anti-racism and anti-oppression a core value is the most important thing with respect to raising your voice, because when that's the case, you make decisions based on that, right? Just like you do anything else that you hold dear. So if you're an environmentalist, or if you're a Christian, or if you whatever it is that you believe very deeply in, those values are going to guide your decisions from small to large every day. And when we make anti-racism a core value, then we'll make decisions based in everything from dating to voting, right? We'll make decisions based on that, at least to some degree. And so that's what I try to encourage people to do, because we have more influence than we think. In our circles of influence, in your circle of friends, in your colleagues, and in your community, you have a lot more influence than I do, right?
Yeah.
So I can talk until I'm blue in the face, and those folks may never hear me or listen to me. But if you speak up in your own way, they're going to hear you. And that, I believe, is what in the United States, and I think in other parts of the world, we need more of. Because I think people have felt like they're disempowered and that they don't have any kind of impact, on racism, on these big things. Because we see that systemic racism sounds huge, and it is. But the way that it changes is by people making different decisions, and raising their voice in those ways. So that's the primary focus of the book.
So what would be an example of systemic racism that you've witnessed?
Well, it depends on the sector. It depends on if we're talking about government. It depends.
No.
But I can give examples.
You do you know what I mean? Your personal experience, because do you know what I mean? Because
Yeah.
I can't personally say that in the UK, my personal experience, I've never experienced racism. If I talk to my friend Sydney, who's a Zimbabwean refugee, he'll tell me he has experienced racism in this country. But I've never witnessed it, but that doesn't mean it never happened. Do you know what I mean? And the one, you know, but he's given me examples, and I'm like, yeah, no, I can see, you know, but you know, he and I worked together for years. I never witnessed it, you know, but he's given.
I think there's a.
Go on.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to say that the one that sprung to mind that he always told me about, which is that whenever he would be walking around town, people would approach him asking him for weed, and he's just and he's like the cleanest, straightest man I've ever known.
Sure.
But for some reason, everybody always thought he was selling drugs.
Right.
You know, but that is purely can only be because of the color of his skin. But you know,
Well, those we call those kind of things microaggressions, and you know, I think that the term is problematic a little bit because the micro, you know, sort of infers that it's small and it's insignificant. But the reality is that they're cumulative. Right? They build up
I
over
think
time.
in these circumstances, it wasn't aggressive. Somebody was trying to buy weed off him. There was no aggression. They were quite disappointed that he wasn't who they thought they were. But it was definitely
Well, there are
stereotyping.
different types. Right. There's different types of microaggressions. There's micro invalidations and others. But the general term just means when somebody applies a stereotype to you or
Yeah.
does something that's biased toward you. And so microaggressions, you know, that may seem small like that, because if it happens once and that's it, never happens again, okay, it's not going to have a lot of impact. But this is something that people experience over time, and it has a cumulative impact on them, right? But then when we talk about the systemic, like you asked about, we can talk about voting, for example. So in this country, the Republican Party has worked very hard to gerrymander districts to exclude people of color so that they can have, you know, primarily white Republican folks voted for in a particular area. There's been laws that are being dismantled right now that protect people's right to vote, that are being attacked in places, particularly where there are a lot of Black voters, a lot of Latinx voters. So on the systemic level in government, you can look at those kind of things.
So what is it they're doing then?
And then
what laws are they changing?
some of the civil rights laws, voting rights laws that were enacted in the 60s, and new laws that are making it more difficult to register to vote, which have a disparate impact on communities of color and low income communities as well. So it doesn't always impact only a community of color. A lot of times, poor white folks are impacted as well by some of these things. And that's one of the things that I also talk about, is how white supremacy often has an impact on white folks that they don't realize. And that's one of the things that's happening right now in the United States, is that, we're talking about effing around and finding out, right? In the United States, there's a lot of white folks that are living in poverty, that voted for Donald Trump, that are now suffering because they're finding out that a lot of the laws that are racist also impact them, because they're in poverty, and so it hurts them. So for example, that we talk a lot about, we talk about welfare in this country, and the narrative, the public narrative that the conservatives want to put out there is that it's people of color, it's immigrants that are on welfare, but the reality is the majority of people on welfare are white folks. And so when they use that racist narrative to decrease these safety nets, it has an impact on white folks as well. So those are the kind of some systematic things with respect to the federal government. We can talk about the same things with respect to hiring. And hiring is connected to higher ed and to schooling, and how there's disparities in education, right? Our schools are in many ways more segregated now than they ever have been, even though we're supposed to have desegregated schools. And we've never had integration of schools. So that's one of the things that we see is that there's underfunding of not only schools where there's predominantly kids of color, but also low income white folks. So again, they're impacted by that, right? Another thing is when the curriculum is controlled, whether it be by textbook companies or by government. If you look in Florida, they've been messing with the curriculum in pre-K through 12 schools, getting rid of all authors of color, getting rid of African American studies, getting rid of anything that speaks to LGBTQ issues. Taking all of that out of our schools has a real impact, and it's systemic. It's done on the state level primarily in this country with respect to pre-K through 12.
I didn't know that. I knew they had cracked down on the LGBT. But I didn't know they'd banned books by black authors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what's happening. Florida's leading the way, if you want to call it leading, but they're banning books by authors of color. They're banning books about
are they
people of
actually
color.
banning books because the author is black, or are they banning the book because of the content?
Both.
Because some of the books that I've seen banned, I don't think kids should be reading anyway, because they're I'm not putting them the broad spectrum of all books, but some of the books that are banned was blatant pornography. And it's just like, okay, you shouldn't be having that. And it's, if I couldn't buy that in a shop under the age of 18, it shouldn't be in a school with people that are under 18. But I don't know the full.
I don't think anybody would. I don't think anybody would disagree with that.
Yeah,
and librarians and school, curriculum developers, they're not pushing porn in schools.
No. I've said some of those books are
to ban a book that's not in any schools, but to ban a book that's not in any schools.
Yeah. That's ridiculous.
That's a false flag, right?
Yeah. That 100%. 100%.
Kind of thing that happens.
Yeah. I'm just the only ones and bear in mind, like, the sort of news that I would get about things in America is sketchy at best.
I'm sure.
Do you know what I mean?
We get a lot of sketchy news ourselves.
Yeah. And so yeah, the only books that I seen that got banned was one, and it was supposed to be like a sexual education, and you're just like, no, you do you know what I mean? That was just basic. That was pornographic under an educational context, and it's just like, no, I don't think that's appropriate for any school anywhere. That's the sort of thing you'd buy in a bookshop with your own money when you're old enough to do so.
I haven't seen any problem with porn being taught in schools anywhere.
Yeah, for sure.
And sex education is something that's optional in most schools. So
okay,
if a parent says that they don't want their kid to go into sex education class, they don't have to.
Yeah.
So I think that there's these false flags that are put out, books like that. But the reality is, if you look at the lists in multiple states now, you're going to see books that are just important books about diverse folks, right? Books about Native American and the genocide that happened in this country, and in many ways is ongoing with the indigenous population of the United States. The same thing with respect to African and African American history. And so when we take out, the things that are objectionable, that white folks don't, enjoy reading about, and we pretend that this country was built by wonderful people who had manifest destiny, and slavery was a peculiar institution. That's the language that is preferred by white supremacists. And that it was a nice thing, and that we civilized people of African descent. Those kind of things are damaging, right? And not only to the people who are descendants of those who experienced that, but to all of us, because it's important that we understand our history in order that we don't do the same things.
Yeah, but Americans, when it comes
past.
to the West African slave trade, my experience of Americans is they're quite ignorant about how it happened.
Yes,
Do you know what I mean?
that's true. And that's because we're miseducated in our schools.
Because there was a European slave trade that was just white people for forever. Do you know what I mean? And
that was primarily indentured servitude, which is a different thing.
No, the word slave comes from Slavics, from So there was slavery throughout history, wherever you lived. It didn't matter wherever you lived, and the Europeans, when they stumbled across West Africa, were buying existing slaves, the same as the Muslims. Do you know what I mean? The whole of North.
We can debate that, but the reality is that debate should happen in schools. I would we all would like students to learn that discussion. Right?
But I think
from historical records, the millions and millions of Africans who were stolen from
they weren't stolen; they were sold.
Cultures.
They were sold by Africans.
They were not all sold. They were not all sold. The vast majority were rounded up. They were not sold.
But they weren't rounded up by white Europeans.
Doesn't make it okay.
No, because this is, like I say, this is one of the things that is... I don't think anybody... Well, I don't think you and I would want company with anybody that thinks slavery is okay. I think you and I definitely can sit there and say, 100%. Like, look, hang on. Yeah. But... Yeah. This idea that white Europeans went to Africa and rounded people up is wrong. We bartered, we purchased, we sold, and we then went on and sold them. That trade continues today in parts of Africa.
It does, and it exists in many parts of the world, primarily around the sex trafficking.
Yes,
that's the primary. And again, one of the things that happens when you whitewash the idea of chattel slavery that occurred in the United States, which was different than the type of slavery that was around the world. When you ignore that or you whitewash it, people don't understand how important it is to end it. We still haven't ended it around the world.
No, we haven't.
And it is important, and most Americans are not taught well enough about what it was to be able to fight against it.
I think because this is where history is different for you and I. So in Europe, the Italians, the Spanish, the Irish, it didn't matter where you were in Europe. You were either wealthy or you were a slave, to some degree, and there was servitude. That was 100% correct. And although we purchased slaves in Africa and sold them to all the places we colonized, that is all true. But UK, very closely followed by Denmark and France within months, were the first country in the world to outlaw slavery. And one of the primary reasons we had a war which we lost to America was our opposition to slavery. And that's where the paths change. Because we lost something like 2/3 of our navy defending, trying to stop the slave trade, and we outlawed it across all of the colonies. And we were the first country in the history of human rights. Human history to outlaw slavery. And all of because the colonizers get this. Everyone talks about the Europeans being the colonizers. It was the colonizers that outlawed slavery.
Well, they started it, and then
no, we didn't. Yes. We didn't start it.
But the colonization was, and religion was used, and disease was used, and all kinds of other things were used to colonize.
But you can go back to Genghis Khan. You can go back to the Egyptians, the Romans. They all understand. That was long before UK was ever a colony.
I understand, but the type of slavery that happened because of the triangle trade and what happened in the United States was unique in that chattel slavery is different. And it doesn't make it, make any other type of slavery better or worse. But trying to whitewash slavery and make it into something that wasn't so bad for those that were enslaved is problematic. In the book I talk about, I was in 4th grade I was taught, that I was given a homework assignment to memorize some important facts about our first, I don't know, 10 or 12 presidents. And, the miniseries Roots had been on a couple years before that, and I'd seen it with my family, and I understood the horrors of slavery, at least to the mind of a fourth grader. And I'm reading through what I was supposed to memorize about these presidents, and it didn't have any mention of them enslaving people. And so I went to the Google of the time, which was my encyclopedia, and looked up, okay, how many of these folks, and it was the vast majority of them, were enslavers. And so I went into the next day and I spoke up in class for probably the first time because I'm a shy person. I'm happy to sit in the back quietly. But I said, you're wrong about these people. They weren't great, right? Doesn't mean that they hadn't done anything great, but they were aware of the horrors of slavery and they chose to enslave people. And we know from their journals that they were aware of the horrors of it and that it
Yeah.
was wrong morally. And they still chose to do it for financial gain more than anything. And by speaking up, I was sent to the vice principal's office and all of that. But it was the first time I spoke up in class because I was horrified by the fact that we were being miseducated in this way. And the teacher, instead of saying, I appreciate your critical eye on this and
Yeah.
all of that, she reprimanded me and told me I was wrong and that these people, that was just what people did at the time, as if the enslaved were not people,
Yeah.
right? And so, and I think that, and also the other part of it is, and this is to kind of to your point, abolition was something that came about from day one in the United States. When the first slaves were brought here, there were people that were against it.
Yeah.
And abolitionists are people that I want to look to and say, that's who I want to emulate, right? I think of what I do professionally and personally as an extension of the abolitionist tradition, right? Because their point was not just to abolish slavery, it was to abolish white supremacy and other forms of oppression. That was the whole thing. If you read what they wrote, that was they went to Ireland, right? Frederick Douglass famously went to Ireland and met with Irish people that
Yeah.
were fighting against oppression. And but so I think of what we do now, in whether you call it DEI or inclusive excellence is a term we use a lot. Then we're an extension of that. We are continuing with the work to end the oppression of people based on these arbitrary things.
I think, I think one of the things that is unique in modern times to America, which is different to Europe. Europe never had a civil rights movement because everybody was, and that's not to say racism didn't exist, but we were racist to everybody. Do you know what I mean? Because, and the reason I say that is because Europe was at war constantly for hundreds of years. So if you were from France, if you were from Germany, if you were Spanish, I don't think people realise that it wasn't until 1976 that Spain was under dictatorship. Portugal, I think, was a dictatorship until the. Do you know what I mean? We had monarchies that were constantly fighting each other. So if you had the wrong accent, you were dead anyway. You know what I mean? Yeah. And you were white. It's so, and that's not to say when black people started coming over on slave ships and stuff like that we weren't racist, but we kind of didn't discriminate in the same way because everybody hated everybody because we were. I mean, there's a famous war that was called the 100-Year War. I think it actually lasted 107 years or something. Now that was literally France, just everybody fighting, and then we had World War One and we had World War Two. So we kind of never had that disparity. Like when with the Commonwealth and stuff like that, if you and I were doing a job, everybody got paid the same. If you were doing the same job, we all got paid the same. It didn't matter what colour you were. Whereas in America, you had that massive civil rights movement for decades. And some would suggest it's still ongoing, but it's so things like that in Europe, like the French Revolution and stuff like that. That kind of everybody, regardless of your colour, had to be united because of you were taking on monarchies, you were overthrowing governments and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that it is complex, and there's a lot of hate to go around.
Yeah.
But I think with
We had a
respect to
class
Europe,
system, which was
but that's where I
really,
was about, that's where I
yeah,
was going to go. It's there's a mix with class and race that happened, and the European pseudoscientists came up with the concept of white supremacy, which was then taken in the United States as to justify the enslavement of people
right,
of
yeah.
color. And so, and I think it also was a big part of, justifying the colonization in India and Africa and the Americas. And so I think that there are two different things, right? There's plenty of hate to go around. There's been plenty of problems
Yeah,
and
I think like
around. But
when
that's the reality is that race and racism has been,
I think one of the things that people
driven by
misunderstand,
Europeans.
yeah, I think one of the things that people misunderstand about when I'll stick with the British. When we colonized other countries and we went over like India, parts of Africa and stuff like that on the African continent, and they would refer to people as savages because they weren't educated or they weren't Christians. They spoke the same about working classes as well, because they were rich,
Yeah,
wealthy, and it was the aristocracy. It was the rich and the
yeah,
wealthy, and
yeah.
you know, if you weren't from the right family, you weren't achieving anything. You weren't going anywhere, and you couldn't. People wouldn't be aware. You couldn't change jobs because the person that you worked for, inverted commas, would actually just write a reference saying that this person is a terrible employee and you shouldn't take them on, and most likely would be writing to their friend anyway. So
Yeah.
they kind of, you referred to it earlier as servitude, but it was servitude 100%, but you were enslaved in principle because you weren't free to leave. And it was actually World War One, I think it was, that freed most people from servitude, because the Industrial Revolution was before that, and then there was just a shortage of jobs, so anybody would take anybody. So a shortage of workers, not jobs. So that kind of freed people up.
The connection between the oppression of class, oppression based on class, and the oppression based on gender, based on race, is economics,
Yeah.
right? And so, I mean, more than anything, the institution of slavery in the United States was about money
Yeah.
and power. And I think that's been true of colonization. It's been true of many wars. It's the reality is that the vast majority of us, in one way or another, have experienced oppression, or our people have experienced oppression by those that are the most wealthy and most powerful. And in this country, it's not a monarchy, but we do have these oligarchs that have, at different times in our history, have been more well known, more and more upfront. But throughout our history, they've had inordinate amount of influence in our government and in what we do. And much of the wars that we've been in have been about economics, not about whatever we try to say.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? We say, oh, we're going there to free. No, we're not. We're not freeing anybody. We want the oil, we want the minerals, whatever it is. Economically, we have an interest. And so our military and our biggest businesses are very much connected. And the government, in many ways, had become puppets. And that's true today, that we're dealing with it in a very overt way right now, with Elon Musk being allowed to run roughshod all over our federal government, firing people randomly, changing policies that help literally his business. Donald Trump is sending his children around the world making business deals, that are
But
that have
with
that are very much against our emoluments and very much
but
against our conflict of interest laws,
Biden did the
and
same though.
they're not being held accountable.
But Biden did the
And I
same.
think it's a matter of scale, because if you believe that Biden's son was doing some shady stuff,
Well,
it's a matter of scale,
if
right?
if Biden's son didn't, he wouldn't have been pardoned.
No, I don't disagree that there may have been something shady there. I really don't know, because we haven't been shown much evidence of it. But I'm not saying that
I've seen the video of Hunter Biden
Yeah.
snorting cocaine off prostitutes.
Well, I don't have doubts that many of our politicians do awful things, but that's not necessarily something that's against the conflict.
I would, to be fair to American politicians, I would put them in the same poisonous snake pit I'd put UK politicians in. And
Sure.
Respectfully, I don't think Trump is any worse than any of them. Do you know what I mean? It's basically saying, like, what smell of shit do you prefer on your shoe?
Well, that's one way to put it, and I agree. I think the vast majority of American politicians are corrupt in one way or another.
I'm sorry, it's just when I listen to people talk about Donald Trump's corruption, I'm like, I hate.
I'm not arguing with that at all. And I think that there are a few that are trying to fight the good fight and genuinely believe in the values that we espouse as a nation. But the vast majority are corrupt in one way, and much of the corruption is legal in this country, right? Yeah. So the money that goes into our politics has been, even the system has been corrupted, right? So now companies can put millions, individuals can put millions into an election by skirting laws that say that you can't give the money directly to, but you can still put up billions of dollars worth of ads if you want to.
It's funny because every year, or I don't know how often that happens, but British news will always talk about the problem with American lobbyists. I don't think I've ever heard the news in the UK talk about lobbying in the UK. They will always talk about American and its problem with the money that comes from lobbying. Never mention what the money that comes from lobbying in the UK.
Well, American news often talks about the corruption of other countries, right? Well, this is a corrupt country. Well, there's no country on the planet, I don't think, that's more corrupt than ours. It's just that we have enough wealth that it's absorbed, and so it doesn't have as much impact. I lived in Malawi for a year, and it's an incredibly impoverished country. When I was there, it had not had. I don't think there was even 10 years of independence at that point. And so this is a country that is in desperate need of development because of the effects of colonization, and so if there was corruption in the government, for example, there had been some money put into schools that were supposed to build new schools, and there was some corruption caused it so that far fewer schools were built than there should have been. It can't be absorbed because there isn't enough money in the system there, right? Whereas here, that corruption may not have had much impact on an outcome, right? Because there's enough money to go around. So when we talk about corruption, we have to think about it at scale, and we have to think about and be honest with ourselves, like you said. So if I've got a politician who will never vote against the country of Israel because AIPAC pays for their campaign, that's corruption.
Yeah, 100%.
Plain and simple. If Elon Musk puts $100 million into your campaign, and then you hire him and let him do whatever he wants in the government, that's corruption, right? There's very blatant corruption going on right now, and our courts, unfortunately, are you just don't know which way they're going to go at this point because they've become very political as well, which is a big problem when we talk about the.
I think when Biden started going after the Republicans in court, that there was always going to be a kickback.
I'm not talking about Democrat, Republican. I'm saying government, right? Okay, so our politicians. And right now, we happen to have a Republican in office who has filled our Supreme Court with completely unqualified people who will just vote in his direction. And we have the same party running Congress. So there's no checks and balances at the moment, very effective. And that's a big problem with our system.
Doesn't every president do that, though? I mean, and this is every. And this is I'm not trying to knock one or the other, but doesn't every president fill all like 100 and something positions with their own people?
Of course, and that's one of the problems with our system is that it's become incredibly partisan, and we really only have two parties. Right? And so we get a vote. We often have a vote between awful and close to awful. That's a reality.
Which smell of
Because
shit do you want on your
they're
shoe?
corrupted by these folks versus this group that's corrupted by
Yeah,
some
yeah,
other folks.
yeah,
Which is the lesser of two evils? That's the way we vote. And people vote, they think in their own self-interest, but there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that people are completely unaware of, and that's why we're in that sort of fuck around and find out mode
yeah,
right now, where people have voted for somebody that they thought was going to protect them, but in reality, they are being very hard hit, you know. And one of the problems globally is the amount of influence and the amount of impact that we can have, good or bad, around the world, is being, corrupted as well. So, ending USAID and the work that they do is highly problematic. Not that USAID was perfect; nobody's saying that, but they are first line of defense against global pandemics. They've done a great deal of work to help with respect to food shortages around the world. And the impact that it's having now on people who voted for the current administration is huge, because the biggest customer of our farmers was USAID,
yeah. The,
and ending that contract for a lot of farmers is putting them out of business
but
or
one of the
making it very difficult for them.
I seen, obviously, the problem with USAID is it was just so massive, and I don't know whether it's fair to say they all got tarred with the same brush, but I remember seeing some of the stuff that came out, and it being scrutinised by podcasters on YouTube and stuff like that, and that they were saying it's just like Elon Musk had approached people in the federal government and said, okay, so where's this money? What's it being spent on? And they were like, don't know. And like,
Yeah.
well, that's $2 million gone. Now, but the problem is it was $1 billion industry, and 2 million from $1 billion is not noticeable, right, to be fair. So and I think like taking your point is, yes, there were flaws in the system, but it wasn't all flawed. And right. But I think the problem, I find it very problematic, and I'm not an American, so I don't have any skin in the game. But when I can see podcasters talking about how hundreds of millions of dollars were not accounted for, but I will concede immediately, I didn't hear anyone talking about the billions of dollars that were accounted for. But there was definitely an issue with USAID.
Sure, and there's issues throughout. And I don't think that anybody in their right mind is arguing that we should allow for those problems to exist. We should root them out. But what has happened is that Trump allowed one of his donors to come in and just cut indiscriminately, right? This whole department is cut. This whole group of people is cut, without saying, okay, let's look for the corruption. Let's look for the bad practice. Let's look for the waste. We're all in favor of that, right? But that's politics. That part is politics. Saying this is about waste is politics. That's not what it's about. Because at the same time they're doing that, we're giving huge subsidies to Tesla and SpaceX, which are companies run by Elon Musk.
Tesla
and not their competitors, right? So their competitors are now losing out because they're allowing, and we're talking billions there.
But I thought the Obama administration was one of the biggest investors originally in Tesla or something like that.
It is possible. I don't know, but that's part of the challenge, and we all want more transparency, right?
Because
we all want that.
Musk was a Democrat originally. Elon Musk was a Democrat originally.
Musk doesn't care about any of that. Musk is who he is, and he's going to do whatever he can to be in power.
To be fair, Mark Zuckerberg was a Democrat until Trump came in, and now he's a Republican. So, but again, it just goes to show donors and money.
They've both bought into a white supremacist base and foundation for their work. And if you look at what they say publicly, there's been a great deal of white supremacy that's been either directly endorsed by Musk or allowed by Zuckerberg. And we can go through, many of our oligarchs in this country. They are people who have, let's say, questionable values that don't align with
I mean,
what the majority of us believe,
Elon Musk
but they
was
have so
raised in
much power.
apartheid South Africa, wasn't he? He's South African by
Yes,
birth and grew up in apartheid South Africa. So,
right. In a family that made a great deal of money off of apartheid,
well,
right?
I just think for legalities, you and I should be careful what we're implying. But for people that don't know what apartheid South Africa was, look it up because that's where Elon Musk was born. And, you know, and I'll just. You and I don't have enough money to defend ourselves against Elon Musk. So,
No,
but
no.
look
But
up.
it would be great if they would deport him. That I'd be all
You
for
know,
that.
but Zuckerberg has he has been public about the fact that I can't remember whether the FBI CI put pressure on him to suppress the Democrats put pressure on him to suppress information or anything that might be positive about Trump, and so he's been public about that.
He certainly didn't.
No, he
In
did.
fact,
He did. He
he's
did at the
allowed a
time.
lot of. He's allowed. That's been part of our challenge around social media. Is that these platforms take no responsibility for what's on them, and Zuckerberg, in particular, has really avoided the idea of saying we're not going to allow hate speech on here, we're not going to allow blatant lies on here, and so they make billions and don't address the fact that we're getting miseducated.
One of the things I heard
on these platforms.
One of the things I heard Zuckerberg talk about was I can't remember which agency approached them, but he basically said, and I think it was to do with COVID. I can't remember exactly, but he said we were asked to suppress every time somebody said something because it wasn't factually true. He said, so we did. He said, that's exactly what we did. He said, the problem is, he said, 12 months later, we find out it was true, but we've already suppressed a lot of it because that's what we were asked to do by the government. And
that doesn't sound factual to me. The reality of what was on Facebook and other platforms is that there was a lot of misinformation about COVID, and some of the people, like our head of health in this country now is somebody who has fought against vaccines, and now we've got a measles outbreak, of all things, and said that COVID was all kinds of ridiculous things about COVID, that it was a weapon used against us from China, and that it was, then, and in the same breath, it's not a real problem, and you shouldn't take the vaccine against COVID, and putting these things out there, and just misinformation. And at the time when Trump was in the first time, talking about ridiculous things, injecting bleach and all these ridiculous things really confused the public, and we lost lives, right? I don't think anybody can quantify it exactly, but people died because they resisted taking vaccines. And we're continuing to have these problems now where people are not vaccinating their children. And we've got measles outbreaks and people dying because of misinformation about vaccines.
Yeah, it's you guys have gone down a funny route with that. We need to be careful about the one of the vaccines that you're referring to, because we might get struck on YouTube. So, hence the reason I no, seriously, it doesn't matter whether you're talking positively or negatively. They last time I had a conversation with somebody about it, they struck the video. So, wow. And we weren't talking negatively about it. We were actually just talking about it. It was just weird.
But that again speaks to corruption. It's not necessarily corruption of government officials, but there's corruption of companies as well.
Yeah.
And there's a connection between our corporate entities and our government entities, and corporate leaders and government leaders, and the corruption of both. And again, I think that's something that we can all get behind, saying, hey, we don't want this corruption, right? We don't want misinformation. The reality is that there's so much money behind all of that it adds to the miseducation that we get in our schools. And we've got a lot of people that are just not well educated. And I don't mean level of education. I just mean quality of education. And then they vote. And we get somebody that's completely unqualified in many roles, right? And that ends up hurting us as a nation, all of us.
But one of the things that's difficult, though, isn't it, is you can't have freedom of speech and then say we're not allowing misinformation.
Well, I think that's an interesting argument. I think there's a difference, though, when a government entity makes a statement that's purposefully misleading, right? Or a government official says something that's specifically intended to be misleading than a regular person on the street saying it, right? We've got to differentiate between the two.
Yeah.
And I think we also have to be clear that there's a difference between an individual or even an organization making a statement. There's a freedom there, and an organization that is purposefully misguiding people in order to make a profit. Right? Those are different things from my mind, and I think that's something that needs to be a part of the national debate and global debate because this has become global.
Yeah, right? I think that's probably one of the largest issues is because of social media is a globalized institution now. It's how do you decide? Because a lot of what's called misinformation is one person's opinion versus another, or it's a political opinion.
But a lot of it is very easily, seen. Like, so Donald Trump the other day said that gas is $1.98.
Yeah.
In this country. It is not $1.98 anywhere in this country, period. That's facts.
Yeah.
Nowhere. Right now, I'm paying over $5 a gallon. The national average is somewhere between $3 and $4 a gallon.
Yeah.
There's nowhere in this country where it's under $2. It's just a lie, right?
Yeah.
And so we have to have a media that is free to say that's not true, right? And what's happening right now is that there's a crackdown on media as well. And we've got pressures by our government on our free media saying, we don't want you to say this is a lie. And if you do, you're going to have these consequences. So NPR gets, kicked out of the White House because they don't want to say Gulf of America. Right?
Yes. Yeah.
Instead of Gulf of Mexico. That's just foolishness.
That is
dangerous because there's an attempted control of the media. Our free press is very important. It's an extension of free speech.
But the free press. So do you remember the famous Joe Rogan ivermectin thing?
I'm not a Joe Rogan person, but
okay. So they accused him. So they accused him of taking a horse medicine when ivermectin is an antiviral drug. So, because I agree with you with you have to have free press, but the press also can't run around saying you should, if somebody's taking a horse medication when it's a well-known antiviral medication that's given out today to human beings for viruses, but it didn't suit a narrative, so they mocked him for it. And I think he was also able to prove that. I'm sure he was able to prove they doctored a picture of him to make it look like he was more sick than he was. Do you know what I mean?
There's plenty of blame to go around, but I think that
should we go with accountability rather than blame? Should we use?
There has to be some responsibility among folks that are just trying to get clicks and
it's a really difficult position.
It is very difficult, but I think that people do need to be held account if they know they're lying about something that can have an impact on folks, and they have a huge platform. That's part of the debate right now. So if I'm Joe Rogan or if I'm Rush Limbaugh or any of these people that have these huge platforms, or Limbaugh's gone, but you know what I mean. These folks that have these big platforms, and you're purposefully lying about something in order to make money. And it has an impact on folks, and people die, right? Or people are impacted in major ways. There ought to be some accountability there. If it's done purposefully just to make a profit, or because you're corrupted, because somebody's paying you, and that is often what the case is. Somebody's paying you to say, that this, this isn't a cure, this is whatever, or just to confuse folks. But we're always going to have crackpots, right? We've got people that think the earth is flat.
Well, I was going to say the problem is if you ban free speech, you have to you get to ban people that say Neil Armstrong never landed on the moon. You get to ban
No,
flat
they can
earthers.
say that. They
Yeah.
can say it all they want, but we want to make sure that young people are taught in school how to differentiate, how to do their own research. There are things that are provable, and how to find that out. So giving that literacy, to young people is important. And like I said, our free speech doesn't come without consequence, right? If somebody, says something, highly offensive in the workplace, they may get fired. That's a consequence for you. You have every right to say it. You're not going to jail, but there may be a consequence for doing it. And I think the same is true for people that have a platform. If they say something that has a dangerous or a damaging impact, they can be held to account for it. It doesn't mean you can't say it, but it means that, if you do that, there may be some consequences for your actions.
Okay. And just
even if they're not legal actions.
Yeah, no,
right?
I mean it's just good old fashioned accountability.
Yeah,
you should be held accountable for things you say.
Right.
Just quickly, two things because I'm conscious of time. Where can people find your book?
It's available online wherever books are sold, and drjoejoe.com, drjoejoe.com. I have all the links to the different online platforms, and you can order it at any bookstore.
And lastly, my random question. If you can imagine you have a time machine, that time machine is a car. What car would be your time machine? Where would you go, and what would be playing on the radio?
Where would I go and what would be playing on the radio? Well, that's interesting. The kind of car, I'd want a big car because I'd probably want to bring some friends. I think I started out in astrophysics, so this is a tough question for me, theoretically. But if I were able to go back in time, I'd probably try to find some point in history where I could have an impact that would be positive and try to help create some kind of change. And I suppose if I had to think of a song that would be playing on the radio, maybe Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On"
Nice
would be a good theme song for that.
And that's a wonderful place to stop. Thank you very much for your time. I've appreciated it.
Right. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Take care. And there you go. We didn't agree on everything all of the time, and we had differences of opinion. What I really, really enjoyed, and full credit to Dr. Joe Joe McManus, is, and we had a brief conversation about this afterwards, is I really do love it when people come on and we don't necessarily agree about everything, but we do have a great focus on what we do have in common, what we do agree on. And I really like these podcasts. I love it when I get to talk to people who I don't agree on with about everything. And he was incredibly courteous at all times, and for that I am really grateful, and I would love to have him back on, and hopefully him and I can arrange to do that sometime. But please do check out his website. The details will be in the description, and check out the book, A Brother's Insight. And as always, wherever you're from, whatever you believe, please do take care and be blessed. Thank you.